Hi there, I'm Morgan Polier, and today I have prepared a lecture focused on Southeast Asia's involvement in the Second World War. Basically, this will delve into the combat, political issues, and the effects on civilians of these countries. Here I've provided a map, and this is kind of just an idea so that we have our bearings on where Southeast Asia is. Here is India right there, and then there is Australia. So that's just kind of a general idea. We'll start with what it was like before the Second World War, as this is kind of important and will play a role in the way that these countries react and the way that Japan goes about taking control of these countries. So before the Second World War, most of Southeast Asia was under European control, namely French and the Dutch. Most of these territories operated as trading centers for these larger world powers. At the beginning of the war, Japan began invading and taking control of these territories. And here I've also included a map. It's kind of hard to see, but it just denotes the European powers and what they had control over. Now we'll cover some major events in the Southeast Asian theater, or the Pacific theater. This was made up of campaigns on the Pacific front. On September 22nd, 1940, Japan invaded French Indochina. This would be known as the Battle of Langson, and it lasted 4 days and ended in Japanese victory, with the French signing over parts of its territories. I've included a picture of Japanese troops marching into Langson, and that is this picture right here above my head. They would also bomb Haiphong on this day. And then we have December 7th, 1941, when Japan targeted Southeast Asia, including Malaya and the Philippines. In the following days, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Thailand, and Singapore all faced land invasions from Japan, as well as air and naval. Continuing on the 10th of December, 1941, following Japan's invasion, the government of Thailand formally allied itself with Japan. This was the first country to do so, setting a precedent for Japanese success early on in its involvement. Japan's invasion of Hong Kong was also marked successful after their surrender on the 25th of December in 1941. Like I mentioned in the previous slide, this invasion followed shortly after the attack on Malaya and the Philippines on the 8th. The initial attacks on Malaya and Singapore were met with fierce resistance by Britain and its territories' forces. This included the Indian troops and Australian troops. Eventually, Japan's superiority in flight machinery and tactics did win them the invasion and forced the Allied powers to surrender on the 15th of February, 1942. This was done by General Arthur Percival, who made the call, and over 100,000 Allied troops became Japanese prisoners of war. Now we'll cover some responses to Japanese aggression in these various countries. Some powers chose to side with Japan, including Siam or Thailand. Many of these countries were under European colonial control and saw it as a chance to free themselves from said control. Other countries fostered resistance movements such as Burma, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Malaya. Some of these, like the Burmese independence movement, which was led by Aung San, even joined Allied efforts, and these Allied forces provided them with weapons and military training to help them with their battle. And this was likely to also protect their assets, but aid in these resistance movements. It's important to remember that existing anti-colonial sentiment in the Southeast Asian region significantly shaped its response. And this was because, like I said earlier, many of these powers were trying to get out of that European control. Now we'll cover the treatment of civilians in Southeast Asia. Japanese occupation saw widespread famine and brutal treatment of civilians. This brought immense suffering to the people of these countries. Some of these events, like the Manila Massacre, which resulted in the deaths of over 100,000 people, and the Bataan Death March in April 1942, which resulted in between 6,000 and 20,000 lives lost. I couldn't find a more specific number in my research, which is why I have such a gap. Now, events like these often take years and years to process, and the trauma can pass down through generations. And we will bring this back up as we talk about the relations between these countries and Japan now. Many civilians were made laborers of the Imperial Japanese Army, and they faced brutal conditions in these roles. This included construction, military support, and work in the mines. Japan set up internment camps in many of these countries they had control over, and conditions were much like a prison and were inhumane. These internment camps were different than America, and I think it's important to note that. Oftentimes the conditions there were worse and they faced more brutal treatment, and that is not to say that the American internment camps were good. That is just to note kind of a difference in extremity. Now we'll go ahead and talk about some of these lasting impacts. Now, following the end of the Second World War and Japan's imperial rule, many nationalist movements across Southeast Asia led to widespread independence movements. This includes countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, and Burma. The shift from colonial rule to self-governance also resulted in power struggles and internal conflicts in newly independent nations as different political factions fought for control. Once again, it's important to note that these countries had been under European control and had no political system set up in their country. So as the emerging political factions are trying to enforce what they believe is best, this leads to many difficult conflicts. The brutality of Japanese occupation, including forced labor and atrocities, left deep scars for many across the region. Many of these scars can still be seen today in these countries, like I said earlier. Now, it's very easy to find today when we are looking at response of civilians and even politicians when they are dealing with Japanese politicians or just Japanese companies and things in that vein, there is a sentiment of untrustworthiness because of what they faced during the Second World War. And I just found that interesting that it's still happening today. Here I've left my sources for my research, and with that concludes my lecture. Thank you for listening.